Hi, Mark Granis here with section 10.1, the inductive principle. This is a pretty short section that introduces us to chapter 10 on inductive reasoning. We'll have a short discussion of it today. First, I'll do a brief introduction to chapter 10, and then we will talk about induction versus deduction, the main difference between them, the technical difference, and then also the typical difference. And then I will go through the inductive principle, and we can see the main four things that it tells us. So, for chapter 10, we move away from deduction and into induction. All of our arguments so far have been deductive inferences. And all valid deductive arguments include at least one universal, right? All men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Where did we get that all men are mortal part? Where do the universals come from for deduction? Well, they come mostly from observation of particulars, especially through our sense experience. It doesn't have to be through sense experience, but it often is. We look at our particulars, we look at a number of different cases of something, and then we tend to generalize from those particulars. And the act of reasoning that draws generalizations out of particulars is not itself deductive. This is the essence of inductive reasoning. This is where we usually get the general rules that we use, like all men are mortal, which we then use as the inputs for deductive reasoning. Now, technically speaking, the distinction between induction and deduction is based on certainty. Deduction is 100% certain. If a deductive inference is valid, then you know that the conclusion must follow from the antecedents. Induction, by contrast, is probable. It's provisional. It's always open to disconfirmation. These are sometimes referred to as black swans because for centuries, everyone in Europe thought they'd seen how many swans? Thousands, millions of swans, all of them white. And it's only when Dutch explorers got to Australia that they realized that swans could be black. So no matter how many times we've seen particulars, even when they all seem to be the same, like all those white swans, you see one disconfirming example, one black swan, and then you know that what you thought was true is actually not true. So the technical distinction is that deduction is certain, induction is only probable and provisional. Note the parallel here. It's not exact, but it's an interesting analogy with subalternates in the square of opposition. Truth, subalternates descend with truth. That is, a true universal makes all of the particulars that fall within it also true. But it takes a false particular to falsify the false universal. Subalternates rise with falsity, right? So it's the true universal that's really, really valuable in telling us things about the things that we don't know elsewhere on the square. But it's the false particular that is the most valuable in telling us things that we don't know elsewhere on the square. So that's the technical distinction. But typically speaking, deduction applies universal rules to particular cases, and induction formulates universal rules based on particular cases. Here are some examples. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We've seen that many times already in the course, and that is a deductive inference, a deductive syllogism, categorical syllogism. By contrast, here is an inductive argument. Thales is mortal, Heraclitus is mortal, Pythagoras is mortal, Parmenides is mortal, therefore all men are probably mortal. This is an inference that is built up based on a number of examples, and it can never be more than probable because we could eventually find an example that disproves whatever our hypothesis is, though we feel pretty good about the hypothesis that all men are mortal. All right, so now let's look at the inductive principle for which this section is named. The inductive principle states that whatever is true of all known instances of a sufficiently numerous and representative set of inferiors is more or less probably also true of their common universal. Now, this principle is a principle about the relationship between the particulars that we're observing and the universal that we want to know about, the universal about which we're trying to formulate some hypothesis. And it tells us four things, all indicated by the red type here. First, it tells us that all the particulars that we're considering really do have to be inferiors of the same universal. In other words, if we're trying to formulate a hypothesis about mammals, then we can't get there from considering, say, dogs, cats, and goldfish, right? Goldfish aren't mammals, so we can't consider them. We can only consider inferiors of the universal mammals. Second, the particulars have to be sufficiently numerous. In other words, there have to be enough of them. There have to be enough particular instances, enough inferiors, for our judgment to be well warranted. How many is enough? Well, generally, the more the better. Your intuition should be the more the better. There's some interesting math about how many are enough sometimes in some kinds of generalizations, but generally, the more of them, the better. You don't want to. It would be crazy to go to Seattle, see one day that the sun shines, and say, "Oh, it never rains in Seattle." That would be a crazy thing to do, right? It's because you haven't been there enough days. You haven't looked at enough individual occurrences. The third thing is the particulars have to be sufficiently representative, right? So if you want to make a judgment about mammals, maybe, or all animals, then maybe you should consider animals that are not all mammals, right? The variety of creatures in the animal kingdom is much greater if you consider, also some invertebrates, some reptiles, some fish, right? And so the more diverse that sample is, the more representative it is of the whole, the stronger your inference is going to be. Finally, you have to account for all known instances. You can't hide or ignore disconfirming instances. That is, it's perfectly fine not to know about black swans and to formulate a hypothesis that says all swans are white. But once you find the black swan, you can't ignore it. Once you know that you have an instance that disconfirms your hypothesis, then your hypothesis is over. So in that sense, you can have certainty with an inductive inference. It's just certainty that it's false. You can't have certainty that an inductive inference is true. That's all we're going to talk about today for the inductive principle. Relatively short section, and we'll be back next time with more on generalizations.